Thank you to everyone for joining us today, just a few days before the July 4th long weekend. My name is Ben Bain. I am the Director for State Capacity at the Niskanen Center, and it is a pleasure to tee up this webinar called How San Francisco Used AI to Cut Red Tape. So we've got three incredible panelists, I guess one moderator slash panelist, because Jen will also do some talking. So I'll do some quick intros, and then we'll get right into all the great stuff. Everybody, all the participants that are tuning in, you should be able to submit questions. So if you see that, submit questions. I'll keep an eye on things as we go, and we should have plenty of time to dig in. So first off, I will introduce our wonderful moderators. So we have Jen Palka, Senior Fellow at Niskanen at the Niskanen Center, but also wears many other hats, but I think she needs no introduction. We've got Daniel Ho, Faculty Director for Stanford's Regulation, Evaluation, and Governance Lab, or RegLab. Thanks, Dan, for being here. And then it is a real honor to have David Chiu, who is the city attorney for the city of San Francisco, and who opened his office and his doors and his staff to enable this project in the first place. So Jen, over to you. I think everybody's very interested to hear more about this story.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you to you and the team for putting this together. I am so excited about this. These are two of my heroes, and I think this work is so critically important. We have seen the results of a world in which we are constantly adding to law and policy and regulation and never subtracting from them. I personally saw that during the pandemic unemployment insurance crisis, for instance, where you're trying to scale a program up, but it's subject to, in many cases, 10,000 pages of regulation. And it's so hard to deliver. And in fact, this is one of the ways in which I got to work with then Assemblymember David Chiu. But what we're going to talk about today is one of the first and I think most promising examples of starting to subtract instead of add in ways that are going to increase the capacity of, in this case, the city of San Francisco. But I think more broadly, we can start to take away what's no longer needed in order to increase the capacity of government generally. So we're going to talk about a project that used AI to analyze San Francisco's 16 million word municipal code and regulations, and I think board resolutions. Someone will correct me for exactly what those 16 million words total, but it's not just the code. And identified outdated or duplicative reporting requirements, resulting in a legislative proposal to eliminate or consolidate 36% of the reports. I will tell you, I have a lot of people who come to me at federal, state, and local level who say, there are so many of these reports. No one ever reads them. Why are we writing them? We could be doing so much more for the public than write papers that no one ever reads. This initiative offers a powerful example of how technology, paired with smart institutional design, we'll talk about that, can modernize government, reduce barriers, and free up capacity for what matters most. So rather than me trying to describe it, let me start out with our fantastic panelists here. And I'm going to start with you, City Attorney Chiu. I will call you David, but I have to start with the formal. Can you just tell us a little bit about this very large volume of regulations, municipal code, board resolutions, et cetera? Why does that matter? Like, if I'm a San Franciscan, does it matter to me that there's so many of these things? What are the practical implications?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for convening us. And full disclosure, Jen and I have known each other for a bunch of years, for my days as a legislator, which I think is relevant to today's conversation. So it's certainly, I would say it absolutely matters when government is viewed as not working as it should. If everything about government were perfect, it wouldn't matter if you had 16 million words or 60 billion words. But the fact of the matter is people don't think it works. And then it begs the question of why. So a little by way of background, I spent 13 years as a local legislator and then as a state legislator. I've personally authored close to 200 local and state laws, and I voted on thousands of others. And when I became the city attorney of my city, so San Francisco, we're a $16 billion government. We have 35,000 employees. And we're governed by these 16 million words in our code and our regulations and our resolutions. What I realize in my current role as city attorney, advising policymakers, is not every single law that I wrote or voted on over the previous 13 years or in the 100+ years before that are perfectly situated for what is happening today. In fact, I would suggest that many of the 16 million words were put into code, voted on by former legislators at a time when they made sense, but they may not make sense right now. And that certainly applies to the almost 540 reports that we have discovered are sitting in our codes, not all of which are totally relevant. And that's really what we're trying to get at. Jen, you have written about the archaeology of laws over time and how when you have laws layered on top of laws on top of laws, we need to take a step back and figure out, are all these laws relevant today? And that certainly was the case when it came to reporting requirements. And I'll just maybe make one other broad comment, which is when I first came into city government after having been in the state legislature, San Francisco at that moment, there were things that were being used to parody our city. I would say not all things about our city are true, but there was a national news story about why it cost $1.7 million to build a toilet in a public space, why it takes us years to build housing, why is it that we have 9 different homeless outreach teams, why is it that it took at the time 4 years ago 11 months to hire a city staffer, why if you want to open up a bakery or a yogurt shop in our city, you've got to navigate 15 different departments. And this is all a function of the fact that we have all these laws and regulations, and they just create what some refer to as sludge within city codes that make things hard. So I would say the number of words is not directly proportional at all to whether government works. In fact, I would say that the number of words probably suggests that it makes government harder than it needs to. Is that a fair
That's
main comment?
super helpful. And it reminds me that if we could wave a magic wand, one thing we would do is have everybody who writes laws do a stint as a city attorney or other leader in the executive branch to really experience the impact of all of these laws. And I feel like your thinking is just so original and so helpful on this front because you've had that experience going from a lawmaking position into, city attorney position, and in hearing from the constituents, this is what it's like for me. I want to open a bakery. I can't, right? I can't actually persist through all of that. So there must have been earlier attempts to look at this. Have there been in San Francisco folks who have tried to say, how do we slim this down or how do we make this more navigable?
So just writ large, yes, everyone talks about it. Do our codes need to be this big? We have a city constitution or charter, which is also ridiculously long. People have talked about this very topic of like, God, there are hundreds of these reports. Do we really need all of them? Everyone's talked about it, but literally the size of our code, the amount of law is so daunting that no one takes on the task. I have 350 legal professionals who are part of my office. I would not assign this task to one or a couple people because it would take weeks and weeks and weeks to go through this without technology. And it's unclear what the result of that work is going to be. So no one thinks about it because it's so bureaucratically daunting.
Jen, if I could, I mean, first,
Yes, please.
huge thanks to you and Ben for putting on this webinar, and huge thanks to David and his incredible team, really, for the collaboration here. Your question, Jen, was about prior attempts, and I think one of the things, just to build on what David said, that is so absolutely daunting is how costly the search process is when you're faced with volumes and volumes of code material like this, even if you have sort of crude forms of keyword searches. So I'll give you kind of 3 quick examples. One is back when she was a law professor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg employed an army of law students at Columbia Law School to search for 59 keywords in the entire US code to find all instances of gender bias. And they knew they had an incomplete enumeration, but that formed the kind of litigation strategy for her to think through, how do we clean up some of these patently discriminatory provisions? In the 1980s, the Reagan Justice Department had an official in charge of a team trying to enumerate all federal crimes, not just those contained in 18 USC, which is specifically about crimes. And I think the person in charge of that effort said, I could die 3 times and be resurrected, and I would never know the answer to this because of just how long this effort took. And that leads to, in the reporting side, on the federal side, the Congressional Research Service tried to do this, and they said, we know we have an incomplete enumeration, and yet we have reports that people like Neil Gorsuch in his book complain of, which is that someone at one point of time mandated that the Social Security Administration should have a report on its printing operations. And what that really meant, going back to your first question, is it meant 95 employees were spending more than 4 months to complete a report for Congress that had a large list of all of the pieces of equipment, including the ages and serial numbers of forklifts and printers in the Social Security Administration's buildings. And those are not the best uses of time for civil servants. It may have served some purpose at the time when it originated, but the question is, how can we overcome that difficult search process to actually make this kind of reform possible?
Having spent a bunch of time on the Hill recently, I can tell you no one is reading those reports. They have other things they are busy with. Dan, you also, since you mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg's project looking for gender bias, you also tested this tool earlier on racial covenants in, I believe it was San Mateo County or San Jose.
Yeah, Santa Clara
Can I
County,
say a
yeah.
few words about that?
Sure. Yeah, this is actually the antecedent in a sense to what became this more general search tool that we call STARA, the statutory research tool. But really there, what we were doing in partnership with Santa Clara County was responding to a state law, AB 1466, that required each of California's 58 county recorders to go through all of their deed records and identify and redact and preserve for the historical record racially restrictive covenants. So for instance, when we purchased our home here in the Bay Area, I had to sign a disclosure that said that this home may not be occupied by anyone of Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, or African descent, except for in the capacity as a servant. Now, that's a really well-meaning law, but what that meant for Santa Clara County is you had 84 million pages of deed records to sift through. And until we started the collaboration with them, they had 2 staff members that had spent inordinate amounts of time going through 80,000 pages of reading to identify racial covenants. And so we built out a system there really to be able to go through that process and take something that could take years of time down to just a matter of a few days to be able to identify amongst these millions of deed records what the ones are that really should go through a formal redaction process. And that then turned into the more general tool that we really used in this collaboration with the San Francisco City Attorney, which is to really think more generally about how do we solve that problem of being able to make it through these mountains of codes and statutes and regs.
But
I think this,
I want to
yeah,
just jump in with a random meta point about this that I just thought about right now. So that law, that state law, AB 1466, I was one of the co-authors of it. It was really in part addressed at this legacy of racism in our housing laws with these racial covenants that stemmed out of racism decades ago, but over time have basically baked into making it just harder to build housing. And so that's kind of the problem we were trying to address. But I think it's I'm trying to think of what the positive. It's a wonderful irony that to solve that, we have technology that is able to dredge through all of the words on the page to find this and get rid of it. So something that has been creating a slowdown on the housing side has meant a travesty on the civil rights side, requiring technology to sort of reverse it, and hopefully at the same time, getting rid of a legacy that, as the Richard Rothsteins of the world would say, through the Color of Law book, has made it harder for us to actually make to make housing in California.
Absolutely. I mean, we found that it was 1 in 4 properties were covered by a racial covenant as of 1950 through doing this scan. So there's this kind of deep history that you're excavating. Of course, sometimes we have to think about, this is so much the heart of this topic, we have to think also about the potential burdens on the bureaucracy itself. And here, the fear, absent the technology, was it an earlier iteration, not the version, David, that you enacted, was that an earlier version could have caused a near shutdown of county recorders if they had to engage in these efforts. And so that's the promise of technology, to really enable this. There are other counties like LA that actually contracted with sort of legacy vendors to try to complete this in like 7 years for an $8 million contract. And what we showed in that collaboration, the technology has changed so radically. You can do this in a matter of days for a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that cost.
Yeah, this falls in that category of, while there are so many fears about AI taking away people's jobs, in this case, I think it's doing jobs that frankly would not otherwise get done. And in some cases are very important to get done. I had a couple other questions, but let me jump because I think the audience here is probably dying to understand just the core of what actually happened here. So Dan, can you just walk us through what actually is STARA? You've given us a little bit of the history of it, how it evolved, some use cases of the sort of prototype or earlier technology. How does it work? And why is it different from just search or a traditional legal, rule tracking tool?
Yeah, well, a little bit of background is I teach here at the law school and also do a fair bit of work around machine learning. And for years, we've been noticing that off-the-shelf AI solutions don't play particularly well when you deal with the complexity of legal language. And so what we developed here is essentially a tool that allows you to represent statutory or regulatory code provisions in the way that we would teach Statutory Interpretation 101 to law students. That is, what we teach them is you have to pay attention to the text. You have to understand the context of where this code section sits. You have to understand the definitions, the cross-references, the terms of art that are being invoked. And essentially what we do is we take something like the San Francisco Municipal Code, ingest it into the system, and represent it to enable the power of large language models to be able to operate on these kinds of code provisions with all of that context being provided. That then enables these kinds of systematic statutory surveys to do what the Reagan Justice Department wanted to do in the 1980s, to find all mandated reports. But really the starting point for the collaboration with San Francisco was actually this ballot proposition, where part of what the city attorney's office had to do is identify all commissions or advisory bodies ever created through any of these codes or resolutions. So in a nutshell, it really is the gist of representing code in the way that we would teach to law students, so that large language models can actually run over that and do a systematic scan over a very large corpus.
David, is it correct to say that the large number of bodies, be they commissions or advisory bodies, is actually contributes to this problem of the high cost of that toilet in Noe Valley?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, so that predecessor issue of just how many boards, commissions, advisory bodies there are in San Francisco, if you were to, there's a fairly well-known article in San Francisco government that said only one person in government knows the answer to this question. There was a reporter who walked around City Hall and went to the mayor's office, went to our local legislature, went to department heads, went to our CFO, and said, do you know how many commissions, advisory bodies, et cetera, there are in our government? No one knew the answer to that. They walked around for days, couldn't figure it out. And then they came to my communications director, who went through a couple of different lists that she was able to find by hand over hours and came up with the answer of 183. And she was the only person who gave a definitive number, which is a mind-boggling number for a city of 800,000. And to your point, Jen, I would suggest that having that number of commissions and advisory bodies, et cetera, not only slows things down, but oftentimes those bodies are in conflict with each other. They take an awful lot of time. Very few people think that 183 of these bodies are actually doing uh, helping to make government better. And so we had a debate for the better part of a year in San Francisco, a ballot measure that tried to eliminate a number of these, and then a competing ballot measure that said, we're not ready to eliminate these, but we're going to create a task force to study how many task force there are. The voters decided to not just eliminate the bodies, but to study it before they do anything. And so we're in that process right now of trying to figure out which of these we want to get rid of. And so this is when we needed to bring Dan in, because my staffer by hand had counted 183, but she didn't go through 16 million words. And so we asked Dan to run through that. And we found a couple more. Fortunately, we weren't off by an order of magnitude, but Dan was able to do in an incredibly short period of time to get an actual definitive answer that no one had been able to do in city government without technology.
Great. So I think we're getting this narrative out here. We have the STARA tool developed by Dan's team at the Stanford RegLab. We have your problem here of a huge number, a huge volume of code and regs and board resolutions, and the need to streamline. So maybe I'll put it back to you for a second here, David. So how did this come about? Can you just talk a little bit about your experience working with the RegLab team? I mean, I think a lot of city attorneys around the country would say, I think if I came to them and said, I would like you to use an AI tool, they would say, oh my gosh, that's very scary. That introduces a whole bunch of risk. I'm not really sure about that. You seem to be pretty comfortable and working with the RegLab team, and it's partly because they are so expert in this and demonstrate a real understanding of government and the law. But tell me a little bit about the experience and were there concerns? How did you overcome those concerns?
Yeah, so I would say, your point about a lot of people finding AI just generally scary without understanding what it is right on. And that has been true through this whole process. For me, I spent a decade working in technology before I became a state legislator, so this hasn't been as scary for me. But let me tell you, really what the process was Dan's amazing team. They took in all the codes and the regulations. We searched for every reporting requirement. They gave us a list of about 540 reporting requirements, but we didn't just take that list without double checking it. So we literally, that was when the human work started, human work that would not have been facilitated but for AI. And first, we just ascertained to make sure that all those reporting requirements were reporting requirements. And then we took those reporting requirements and then we went to 100 plus city departments and said, all right, planning department or Department of Building Inspection or police department, here are the reports that you are required to do. Do these reports still make sense? And so we went through this very human process of a deep engagement with every department where we said, this is what we think you're supposed to do. Does that make sense? Do you want to keep doing this? And the departments, after quite a bit of work, came back and said, almost 2/3 of these reports are probably still worth doing in a variety of different ways. But about 1/3 of these reports are absolutely antiquated, they're obsolete, or they're redundant, and we should just get rid of them because they represent an incredible amount of time. And I will tell you that this work, the work for us really started when the AI platform gave us the information, but it did require a ton of human analysis. And then once we understood the 170 plus reporting requirements we wanted to get rid of or change, we then had to draft this enormous ordinance of, I want to say 350 pages worth to delete most of this code. So we've had hundreds of human hours that have gone into this to sort of double check the work, but this work would not have been possible without AI, but the output of this work would also have not been possible without a ton of human work.
Just
I
to
think it's,
just to build on that, if I could, Jen, I mean, I
yeah.
think what was we did this actually, David, your team spent extraordinary efforts on this, but actually I was looking back at the calendar, from the time that we identified the target of legislatively mandated reports through to the introduction of the 351-page ordinance, I think was about 2 months. So that is really like a remarkable testament to the efforts of some key amazing staff members that worked on this. But I would highlight that what was really important early on was that David's team was really open to kind of a collaborative process where we were really exploring what the highest value use cases of Stara were once we had ingested the San Francisco code and resolutions, and that included prompt refinements, going back and forth on kind of preliminary output, building trust in the system to show that we could identify all of the commissions you had identified previously and about 30 some more. And so that was useful to really make sure to kind of benchmark. But I think there's a kind of trope out there where people often think that AI is going to replace human discretion. I would say here, really, Stara enabled this process to get off the ground, and then enabled the David's team to really focus where human discretion was so critical and could not possibly be replaced through this departmental consultation, which was absolutely critical for this process.
Yeah, I think we're at the start of really building a whole, a field and practice where we use AI to do this. And so it's important to pull out those early best practices. And one thing I hear, just to lift it up, is you build trust in the model through actually using it and testing it and checking it, so that you don't have this anxiety, because you've engaged and you've put it through its paces and seen where it's good and where it isn't. And yes, I think it's a very double-edged sword, where people sometimes think if we bring in AI, it's just going to do it. And, that makes it sound very magical. In fact, humans are still in charge, right? Humans made all of the decisions here. The downside of that is, yes, it's not a magic wand. And in fact, it's still a lot of work. I mean, I hope everyone takes this away. It is possible because of the technological help, but it is still a lot of work. But that means that we're still in charge. And so on that note, Dan, would you mind actually just showing us what this looks like? I want everyone who's here today to want to use this tool or similar tools. And I think it'll help if we can just see what it actually looks like, so we know what we're getting into here.
Yeah, let me go ahead and just screen share here a little bit. It's a kind of web-based tool. So what this kind of looks like is here I just have kind of the SF commissions task up. What is required of the user is really to kind of craft a prompt of what is it that you're searching for. And here there's a bunch of iteration going back and forth to actually really put in the prompt the specific language of the proposition and which commissions are really ones of interest. Then you can, as a user, define things you want to extract from each of the code provisions. And then you end up running the task. And so here would be the results of a task like this, where there's some 300 or so positive results. And we kind of organize it by, in San Francisco, there are these distinct codes. So you can go through and navigate here and, for instance, look at something like the administrative code, where in chapter 41, what you get is a kind of summary of how the AI system thinks of whether this is a kind of commission of interest. Here, for instance, a statutory provision that creates the San Francisco Residential Hotel Operators Advisory Committee. And this was one of the committees that Stara was really able to add to this comprehensive list. We have some more experimental features in here too that allow you to actually get some simple sort of analysis. So for instance, if you were to ask how many commissions are related to housing, for transparency purposes, we kind of give you all of the steps that this goes through, and it can kind of give you an initial estimate. Of course, all of this is still subject to human review of the number of commissions that are related to housing and rough areas. And this sort of AI agent is one of the more sort of experimental features. And then, of course, the key thing that really was the input into the departmental consultation and prioritization that David described is you can download the report of all of the commissions that were found. For us, it's also really important that there's transparency, right? So you can look at any of the negatives, and if through a number of benchmark tests, we kind of validated that both precision and recall were extremely high for this kind of a system. But that's Stara sort of in a nutshell. And that then kicked off the process, I think, on the city attorney side after doing a bunch of iteration to figure out, well, what is actionable coming out of a report that Stara generates.
We're getting some questions in the chat about what happens next. And I think David actually spoke to this a little bit already, but Kelly had asked, once the laws are cleaned up and less prohibitive to action, what's next? How do we enable action and outcomes? Well, you spoke to that a little bit. I wonder if you want to add to that, David.
Well, first
And
of
if
all,
you give any examples.
yeah, so where we are right now, we're in the legislative process of trying to remove the 170 plus reports that I've just mentioned. So, we spoke to departments. They said, here are the rules, or here are the reports that are just not worthwhile at this point. And we're going through the legislative process to essentially reverse and pull these reports out of our code. I will say, I know there's some skepticism because people feel like this sort of just came out of AI. They're not sure if they can trust it. So I've had to do a lot of explaining about the human side of this. People also wondered, well, why couldn't every department just kind of do this on their own? And we've had to explain that most departments probably wouldn't do it. But for the fact that we were doing this as one citywide exercise, it really sort of facilitated this. But, from my perspective, assuming that this ordinance to delete past reporting requirements gets done, we're going to be thinking about other opportunities to look at it. So I'll give a different example.
Great.
There are hundreds of fees that have been put into our code over many, many decades for this or for that. There is interest in figuring out how to rationalize that, like put it all in one place so we can look at it to see if it makes sense. When I was a supervisor, this is probably 15, 16 years ago, I had run a small business, and a lot of small business folks were annoyed at just how many fees they have to pay. Oftentimes, they don't even know about the fees until they start running a business, and then they get slapped with something. So I had told my staffer at the time, can you find fees where it costs more to administer the fees than the city actually brings in money? So in other words, we are charging small businesses, let's say $400,000 worth of fees, or $200,000 worth of fees, but it takes 2 or 3 bureaucrats that cost $400,000 to do it. And I said, let's just get rid of the ones that we know of. And we got rid of a couple dozen. My guess is there are many, many more times that fees on the books that people aren't aware of, that a lot of folks would say, it just doesn't make sense for us to do that. So that's an exercise that I'm interested in thinking about. But I think we want to just play out this exercise now on reporting requirements and see how that's done. Maybe one last thing I'll say. Part of why I was interested in looking at reporting requirements was, one, we've heard from a lot of departments who've said we have too many of these darn things. But also, I know as a former legislator that legislating a reporting requirement is often a lazy person's way of telling the public you got something done.
Yeah.
If you're being told, solve a problem, clean the streets, solve crime, create jobs, and if you can't figure out an easy way to do it, but you can say, and I'm going to create a report that tells us in a year some piece of data and how to do it, so I can tell the public this is what I'm doing. It's a legislative trick. And this has happened, I know this as a former local legislator, definitely as a former state legislator. In Congress, there was a report put out somewhere about the black hole of reports at the federal level, because Congress is so stymied right now that oftentimes you can't get much done except to create a report. And so at the congressional level, thousands of reports that are required, where most of them aren't read. And I would say that's probably true for most reports at all levels of government. They sit on
Yeah.
shelves, and just collect dust.
My favorite
Well,
example of these, oh, sorry, Jen. My favorite
no, I'll just
example
say
of these.
what I remember back when during the pandemic unemployment insurance crisis, when David was in the assembly and I was working with the Newsom administration, if we'd required, or if there were a lot of reports being written and some by the legislative analyst's office, but the problem was actually asking the right questions. That was, and just say we need a report and it's going to be generally in this territory, you're likely to get back a lot of information, but not necessarily a lot of insight, because I can attest to the value of this amazing team that we had on the ground that really dug in and found the exact right questions to ask that unlocked our ability to clear that backlog. A report would only have added work and actually detracted from our ability to clear the backlog, not added to it. But Dan, you were going to say something, and then I want you to comment a little bit on where David's talked a little bit about where he'd like to use this next. Where do you want to use it next, either in San Francisco or in a different jurisdiction?
Based on this experience, I'd take any opportunity to continue working with San Francisco. I think it's just been an amazing kind of effort. I guess I was just going to give a couple of examples here to make it clear to folks who may be listening. At the federal level, one of my favorite examples of this is the Federal Reserve Board is required to create an annual report on the presidential dollar coin program. And it has dutifully filed that report every year. And since 2011, there's language in every single one of those reports that says, the presidential dollar coin program has ceased to exist as of 2011, and we kindly request that Congress relieve us of this reporting obligation. And this is probably not the highest order thing for the Federal Reserve Board to occupy staff member time with. And in San Francisco, I think what was so brilliant about the extensive consultation that the city attorney's office did is it both surfaced things that were potentially obsolete, like a report on fixed pedestal zones for newspaper racks, which are by and large obsolete at this point. There's just not that many of these physical newspaper racks that should
Can you say
occupy.
what a fixed pedestal is?
It is literally a slab of cement on which a bunch of newspaper racks sit that used to, allow you to drop in a quarter or whatever it was at the time and get a copy of the Chronicle. We probably don't need a kind of biennial report on fixed pedestal zones for newspaper racks these days. But there were also instances where it just made where what you had is what you've described so brilliantly, Jen, in your work, of the accretion of different requirements, where there was an 80-year-old provision that required the redevelopment agency to report. And there'd been so many reorganizations and additional stateside reporting obligations that it just made sense to consolidate a bunch of these distinct reporting obligations and streamline them so that you don't have a bunch of scattered different teams creating distinct reports that may be overlapping. And I thought that was a really brilliant strategy by the city attorney here to figure out not just what should be deleted, but what could be potentially consolidated and streamlined, so that instead of having 5 housing reports, you might have one kind of annual housing report.
I want to just add one quick thing. I'm sorry I don't have this in an easy slide, but Dan helped to generate this chart, this graph that basically shows over time how many reports over the years. And so what you can see is the typical, it's almost a hockey stick. Every decade we layered more and more reports, but I would suggest that I don't think the public thinks that the fact that we have more reports means that we have better results for government.
Yeah, here it is, sort of in sort of slide format. So what this is there's some uncertainty because of how enactment and amendments are represented, but this gives you a sense over time, the cumulative number of reports. So as of about 2000, there were less than 200 reports. And it just kind of skyrockets as a strategy of what you require of the bureaucracy. And this is by no means matched by an increase in FTEs. At most, our census FTEs in San Francisco have increased about 10% over that 25-year period, whereas the number of reports have more than doubled. And I think Frank Fukuyama had a piece that really described this as the prototypical instance where government is made inefficient by layers of rules that bureaucrats have to labor under. And we have to be asking ourselves the question of whether things like the fixed pedestal newspaper rack report are the highest priority thing for our amazing civil servants to be devoting their time to.
When there is so much that we need government to do. Okay, we have like so many great questions. I'm gonna start with a bit of a personal bias and ask Libby Schaaf's question, our former mayor of Oakland and now running the Electeds Network for the Abundance Network. Are you making this tech or service available to any other cities? How can we get more cities to engage in this productive process?
Yes, we are right now kind of doing we're making it available particularly to jurisdictions who would like to work on these kinds of efforts. Our medium-term goal is to actually release the tool open source. The main thing that is a little bit of a constraint for us right now is, well, there are two things. One is that it does take a little bit of work to represent each of the codes in the way that Stara really is able to shine. And so right now we're working on doing that for across all the 50 states, and have been working with several other jurisdictions on that front already. And then in the long term, for those jurisdictions, the plan is actually to make this available as an open tool. But please do reach out to us if you're interested in pursuing similar kinds of efforts.
And we'll have something at the end to make sure everyone's got that. Maybe we'll put follow-up in the follow-up email that you get. Rich Weissman asks a question, maybe David, you could speak to. How do you deal with political forces that are not aligned with technology? Many of those who are in positions of power but do not understand AI or technology. And how did you manage to work around that obstacle?
Well, the irony about this is San Francisco, we are considered, if not the capital of where AI is happening, a very significant capital where AI is happening. And yet within our government, there is a lot of confusion, fear, concern about how to do this. So it has just taken a lot of time to educate people on what we're doing and what we're not. And frankly, I think that if there was a little more comfort around AI, what I mentioned about a third of reports being eliminated, that might be a bigger number. But there's sort of this, there's a fear of the unknown. I will tell you, I filed a lawsuit in the AI space last year, which has been widely popular for us to do. Just to explain what it was, I had a couple of moms who read an article about artificial intelligence being used to create deepfake pornography, taking images of women and girls and turning them into pornography within 30 seconds. And it's an entire field that is unregulated. We have 100 companies that are doing this, hundreds of millions of page views done. And so I filed the first lawsuit against 16 of these largest companies. And there was unanimous support across the board, all spectrum. This is important. Go after AI in this way. So that was going after kind of a problem with AI. In this instance, we're using AI to solve problems, and yet there just frankly has been pushback. And so it's just going to take time to educate people and explain to folks what the human touch points are, so that folks can be comfortable that the machines are not taking over government and proposing the machine deletion of code.
Yeah, if I could speak to that, I mean, there is a huge space between the hype and reality of what AI can do. And I think one of the really difficult pain points for government in particular is that because very few technologists go into government service, separating kind of myth from reality can be so difficult. That is in part why we do a lot of these collaborations here at the RegLab. That's kind of our mission, which is to drive down that knowledge gap and figure out what are the kind of responsible and beneficial use cases of this technology, given some of the really significant challenges of government programs that we observe. I guess to some of those who are skeptical of this kind of or those you've encountered, David, who are skeptical, right? We already use technology to do this kind of search. It is extremely outdated technology because it is a keyword search where you're asking someone in the city attorney's staff to spend thousands of hours doing a keyword search for any time the word report or commission occurs in 16 million words. That is not the way to do this, and that is how we will never be able to get rid of this kind of policy sludge and policy craft, in the same way that it is not a good path forward to implement AB 1466 by having humans read in Santa Clara County alone through 84 million pages of things. That is a way to prevent meaningful forms of reform that are so urgent at this particular time.
Several people sent me Elizabeth Warren's tweet recently, or I guess we were supposed to say her post on X, where she says, I won't use AI, it lies. And it's just sort of an unfortunate setback, I think, just speaking to the person's question here about some of the
Can I say something on that, Jen? Because actually,
yeah,
you know, our
please.
team has done this. Our team actually is a lot of overlap between Team Stara and a team that did a lot of benchmarking on what we called legal hallucinations, which is in general purpose off-the-shelf AI systems. The rate at which these models make up cases, statutes, and laws is alarmingly high, between 58 to 88%, as we estimated in one of our papers. And that's because these are off-the-shelf models that are never meant for this, for like research, for deployment in legal research and application. That's why we now have over 140 cases that have involved hallucinated legal citations. But there's a big difference between, you know, AI that generates sort of passages and citations, and the power of large language models to make search much better and improve from something like keyword searches. I'll just give you the simple example on the racial covenant side. If you just did a keyword search and searched for the term white, you would be, in the words of Fez Sarani, who led this project, you would be drowning in a sea of false positives, because every instance where a deed record mentions White Road, the White Company, Mr. White, you'd have to have staff reviewing that. And that is the thing that stops these kinds of projects dead in the tracks. And that is the kind of thing that large language models really can powerfully solve.
I mean, I don't want to go down a Doge road here, but it seems that they've been using keyword searches to find things like diversity in very inelegant ways. It's hard for me to comprehend why they are not using more advanced technology to do the work that they've been doing. And it's frankly, they should be embarrassed. But yes, somebody please somebody on this webinar certainly is connected with Elizabeth Warren's office. Get us an opportunity to show her Stara so we can get her on the AI for Good bandwagon here. There are a number of questions in here just about the model itself. So I think we've got a few more technical people in here than I had imagined we would, which is great. One person asks, can you share a bit more about the development process? What base model was used, training protocols? I think there were a couple other questions along the same lines. So Dan, if you could just give a little bit more on that.
Yeah, we're happy to share the technical paper, but essentially this is much more of an engineering challenge than it is a sort of retraining of large language models. The STAR is set up to actually be able to swap in any base model. We can use Gemini, and I think the work with San Francisco, we used Llama. The key engineering is really representing the code language in a way that would be meaningful to a lawyer given the full context the operative kind of code language, the definitions, the cross-references, and the like. And then we did experiment around with whether it's better to kind of allow for fine-tuning or few-shot learning. And within Stara, we do enable few-shot learning, which we found to actually, for at least the tasks we've benchmarked on so far, perform pretty comparably to fine-tuning. Maybe the other thing I'll just say is what is distinct about Stara relative to some of the other ways of approaching this problem is that even tools like deep research are not meant to be comprehensive. Given the 16 million lines of work, when we try to actually have deep research do something like this, it will just stop because it's not worth the inference compute budget to run over all of that material. We did some similar benchmarking in that paper against tools by Thomson Reuters and Westlaw. So this is really meant to do something that is a systematic statutory and regulatory scan. But I'm happy to drop in the link to the more technical components of the paper since there are a few questions on that front.
I think you've got a lot of fans coming out of this. Okay, here's a very good and very tough question for both of you, and it's from Oliver Rothschild. When you think about your big dreams for where this work goes, what is the most ambitious version? And how do you think about outcomes? For example, you mentioned 3 bureaucrats doing the $400,000 fine. You would eliminate those 3 positions, or is there some other way to think about the results? There's sort of a couple questions embedded in there. Let's start with the first part. What is an ambitious version of this that really gets to something super meaty? Either one of you.
I would love to have you answer that question as well, Jen. I know you have done some thinking along these lines, but David, why don't you go first?
Oh gosh. I think there is so much about the complexity of government that needs to be pulled apart, right? So let's take the housing process, where every year, locally and at the state level, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of laws that are passed to address housing. In fact, and in the last 5 years, a lot of these laws have been trying to streamline the process, but every single law creates a level of complexity. And so figuring out a way to sort of model that complexity and then to think about what it would mean to simplify that, to get at the goals that we have. Because I think all policymakers, I'd say this as a former legislator, are well-meaning. There may be competing goals. People may look for different things, but by and large, people want, let's say, more housing. They want housing to be more inexpensive. They want housing to house more people representing the diversity, the economic diversity of our societies. And yet you have just huge body of code that requires bureaucrats, folks in the executive branch, to follow outdated, conflicting, redundant, confusing content, and it just gets in the way of actually delivering what government is supposed to deliver. And so thinking of how any technology working with human beings can, again, simplify, eliminate, make things easy so that we can cut to the chase in delivering the results that people actually want.
If I can build on that, but I definitely want to hear your answer, Jen. Since you mentioned the housing example, David, that actually is very top of mind for us, because part of what you get is you get state legislation that, for instance, is supposed to make the construction of housing or accessory dwelling units easier. Huge potential solution for the housing crisis we face in California. But the complexity of it is that there's a separate state agency that then has to follow up and manually read through every single county and city ordinance, do a comparison, so that the city of Palo Alto just a few months ago got a letter that says, here are the 20 ways in which your local ADU ordinance is in conflict with the state statute. And as a result, this really well-meaning set of state legislation can take years to trickle down into when someone can actually have a streamlined process to build an ADU on their property. That is within reach of current technology to at least assist in that process, so that we're not taking 5 years for that kind of state legislation to trickle down to the localities where the rubber actually hits the road. And I guess that's the other way I would answer Oliver's question, which is, I do think what you started off with, Jen, which is how do you start to move this into prospective legislation so that you could potentially begin to forecast how much of a burden is this imposing on the civil service? Is that worth the cost? And to have that, much as we do budget scoring for legislation generally, so that we're not having to do that kind of cleanup ex post. On the reporting stuff, for instance, I think something that you, David, have mentioned in the past, it probably makes sense to have a default sunset for a lot of reporting obligations for renewal, on the assumption that whatever might make sense now should at least be revisited 5 or 10 years from now. But Jen, I really do want to hear your answer to the question.
Well, first, let me just say, I think the most recent question that came in was, how do you envision similar tools for writing new legislation? I think you got your answer there, Elizabeth. I think that is one of the exciting places we want this to go. Yes, I have a huge desire and appetite to see these kind of tactics and strategies and tools applied to a very wide range of areas where we need help. Permitting is going to come up a lot, permitting for housing, permitting for green infrastructure, for sure. Think of all the ways that we could just expose and explore the complexity in that system. And it doesn't, to the other questions that have come up, it does not magically reduce the any opposition to changing the, to reducing that complexity. That is still a human and a political problem, but it helps us get to the stage where we can do it. And I think we're in an environment where that could happen. We need this in professional licensing. We need this in healthcare. We need this in education hugely. And I think what you have all heard from David and Dan today is really so early stages. This is not a webinar to explain that we've solved the world's problems and now we know what to do. It's that we have started the explorations that are needed to start attacking bigger and meatier and more consequential. Not that these are not consequential. I think they'll have a huge impact. But I think in the next time we talk, we'll be talking about something where you can really draw a straight line to an outcome that people are really upset about or really eager for, whether it's better schools or better healthcare or more housing. We're getting there. And I think the reason we had this webinar in the first place is that we feel like all of you who are interested in this can be partners, whether it's directly through the Stanford RegLab, whether it's learning from David's wonderful team in the city attorney's office, or coming through Ben and his team at Niskanen. We want this to be the start of something big, so please reach out. And with that, let me just say thank you, Dan. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ben and the Niskanen team. And thank you all very much for coming. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but people can you can follow up. We can reach out to each of you. And what's the best way for people to follow up, Ben?
So we'll follow up. We will send the recording out to everybody who RSVP'd. We can also include some attachments. So we'll make sure that we're pointing people in the right direction for all the technical reports and everything else. And then, yeah, we'll just create more opportunities for this because we're excited to follow along on the journey of everything, David, that you're continuing on. And then Daniel, as you're doing stuff all around the country, we want to be able to help tell that story. So we'll definitely be in touch. We'll put out contact information as appropriate.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Dan. Thank you, guys.